Hello, everyone, and greetings. I am sorry that it has taken me this long to get to this particular video, mainly because I've had a lot of people who have said that the summary video for Plato through the Enlightenment was a really good video, but there have been others who have asked for more detailed sort of discussion of the theorists that we sort of breeze through here in the beginning of the Enlightenment, the end of the Renaissances. So let me do that really quickly. And I'm actually basically going to breeze through probably about 12 to 15 theorists and let you know what I think you should be getting out of them. And if you've read them and you haven't gotten this out of them, then go back and read it again or look at the introduction or whatever you need to do in order to make sure that when you're reading, you get the ideas down that you need to get down. As some of you could see, my lighting is blaring into my eye. That's the wrong word. I'm looking for a different word for very, very bright. There's been a little bit of brain fog this week, and it's very clear right now. So let me get these glasses off. Let's start there. I think that will probably help a great deal. Yes, less reflective material is always a good thing. And I'm just going to tell you, this is going to go fast, and it's going to be long. So sit back, get comfortable, prepare to fall asleep periodically, and hopefully you'll get through the whole thing eventually. That's kind of how I feel about most of the stuff that I record, right? I was thinking today, like, I really, really wish I could have background music when I'm giving these lectures. That would make them more exciting, but you probably may miss a few things. I will definitely get distracted. So I guess silence is the better part of valor in this case. And so let us be brave and dive in. Now, the piece that I gave you called From Plato to the Enlightenment was supposed to cover everything that was in week 6 for the most part, and it didn't, at least not to the extent that you all would have liked it to, so let me do it again. And that's not a bad thing, by the way. I appreciate all of you who have asked for this video, and I'm more than willing to go into more detail about any of the theorists that you're interested in. I've had a couple of requests, so I'm going to focus more on those, but I will go through everything on your syllabus. So if you want to pull out your syllabus, you can go ahead and go right along with me, and you'll see how quickly I move through about 400 years of rhetoric as quickly as possible. I told you guys that there would be a lot more to do in the later portions of this semester than there was in the beginning. In the beginning, we really wanted to focus on understanding the deeper meaning of what these theorists were saying. And now we're sort of like, okay, all these theorists are saying similar things, as opposed to one theorist is saying completely different things. So now we're into quantity a lot more than we're into quality. That's not to say any of these are bad, but you'll see the debates that sort of start to go on in the late Renaissances, which those debates are, again, between the three things: rhetoric, the aesthetic, and science/reason. And so let's talk about that. After the Middle Ages, towards the end of the Middle Ages, we of course had Christine de Pizan, who was a poet. She wrote for like the favors of the knights and so on. And she really was in a position where she was educated, but she wasn't part of the royalty or the royalty, or she was a courtier. And so to be a courtesan, you had to be able to present yourself well at court, literally, to the court of the kings and the princes and the princesses and so on. So the thing is that she was very quickly, her husband died, her father died, and she was stuck with children's mouths to feed, and I believe her mother's or her mother-in-law's. She had a lot to do and to take care of. And as a woman during the medieval period, that was not easy. So what she did was she wrote these books of poems. She sold poems to different various people. And then, of course, she wrote these two pieces that we are most familiar with, The City of Ladies and The Treasury of the City of Ladies. And a lot of people, as I've said in the past, thought of this as an etiquette book, but it's actually about how women maneuvered in the court, through the court, by talking to, quote unquote, the princesses. So she addresses the work to the princesses, and specifically to tell them how to behave in such a way that they'll most effectively be able to communicate thoughts and ideas to their partner, whoever that might be. Or if it was someone whose father was the king or a prince or a knight, and they wanted to convince their father to do something specific, then women could do that, but they had to know how to do it. So much more than a book on etiquette, I try to think of it about more as a book on empowerment. And the last time I checked, I think I might have told you guys this already, but every semester runs together. That's because I get older and you all stay the same age. But there is, I believe, someone named Dudash at the University of Notre Dame who studies Christine de Pizan in French literature. And that is very awkward when you try to Google that, let me tell you. So those are those two books. And essentially, so they were used mainly to make money. This was not about some big feminist movement. It's more about organizational communication, like how to maneuver through being on the court, what to say when you go to speak to the court, when you go to have tea with the people who are members of the court. Those courtesans would do that. If you ever watched the movie, nope, I'm not going to remember the name of it. It's Drew Barrymore, and it's the story of Cinderella and Leonardo da Vinci and all that other stuff that they just sort of throw all together, even though it was a Russian story initially. I can't think of the name of it, but I love that movie. I need help for why I love that movie. It's terribly acted. It's a horrible script. But in that movie is where they really demonstrate how the courtesans worked and what they did and how the amount of money that you had dictated where you ranked on the court. Okay. All right. So if you want to go look up that movie, feel free. A lot of information. Do Gray Scott, Drew Barrymore, the Cinderella story. It's called something else. Whenever you figure it out, maybe you can text me and tell me. All right, so that covers really Christine de Pizan. We don't spend too much time on her, mainly because women at the time didn't have a lot of impact on rhetoric, but this was one of the greater impacts. The next person that I have listed is Erasmus, and I went, I think, according to the chronology of your book, which, you know, when you have people writing at the same time period, in the same time period, it's harder to know exactly when one stops and the next one picks up, because it's not like these authors wrote in succession of each other. That's not how that worked, right? There were people writing in a certain time period, and, it would be like if you had Dean Koontz and Stephen King together on a stage to talk about horror writing, right? They're both writing at the same time. One is clearly better than the other. And if you don't know who I like better, we should get to know each other better. But, it's sort of contemporaries, okay? So we move through this very slowly with contemporaries, but we moved to Erasmus, and he was a member of the Protestant Church. I believe he was a minister. And he wrote about many things, but the idea of how to use language to most effectively communicate what gifts God has given us, so to speak, was his main interest. He was interested in style. Okay, so his work on copia, or copia, I believe is how it's called, think of cornucopia, during Thanksgiving. What does that mean? It means bounty, right? So copia is about the overabundance of words. And that's fascinating to me because he calls it that, and he says that we should avoid an overabundance of words. I mean, I believe that the first half of his book is all about not being too wordy and choosing the right words. And then the second part of his book is all about using more words effectively. And it's a very confusing thing. Do you want us to use more words or less words? And of course, his point would be, it's not about more words or less words. It's about the quality of the quantity of words that you're using. And so if you're using the good words, then that's better communication, better persuasion, more effective. But if you're just putting out words out there, kind of like I'm doing right now, just for no reason, just adding words for the sake of time, that is really ineffective and not a good practice. Okay, Peter Ramus. Now, this is one of my favorites. And one of the reasons why he's my favorite is if you haven't read him yet, go read him because he's fun. And I don't mean fun like Phaedrus fun, although that's fun for me. This is a little bit more on point, like on the nose fun. Peter Ramus was always wanting to become the chair of rhetoric. He always wanted to be in charge of that. And he wasn't allowed to be. And one of those reasons why he wasn't allowed to be was because of this particular work. In this particular work, which I believe is called Arguments in Rhetoric Against Quintilian, if I remember correctly, that's the full title, I think. In that work by Peter Ramus, it's the only one I have you read by him, and it's the only one I think that's available in your book. In that, he actually explains how Aristotle, Cicero, Quintilian, all those old philosophers, old dead white guys, so to speak, are stupid. And this always reminds me of The Princess Bride, right? Like Peter Ramus reminds me of that scene in The Princess Bride. If you've seen it, you'll know what I'm talking about. The man in black meets up with Princess Buttercup and not Vizzini, but yeah, I guess it's Vizzini. And Vizzini, of course, is supposed to be the smart one. And he says to the man in black, I'm smarter than you are. And the man in black says, really? And he said, have you ever heard of Socrates, Aristotle? And the man in black says yes, and he says morons. And that's kind of what Ramus does here in the context of rhetoric. Now, that sounds simplistic, and that's one reason to read Ramus, because he's funny in that sense, and he's not intending to be. Let's just be clear about that. He was not intending to be humorous. It just comes off as humorous. One of the reasons why it comes off as humorous to me is because he's so blatantly wrong about some things, right? For example, he's talking about Aristotle and Aristotle's use of syllogism, and he says Aristotle writes terrible syllogisms, and then he writes this really awful syllogism where the first premise, which is supposed to be a grand truth that we all already agree on, isn't. And I'm just like, what? That is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Let me prove to you why Aristotle's bad at syllogisms by writing a really bad syllogism. And that's sort of fascinating. And he sort of goes off a little bit about Aristotle and his thoughts on rhetoric. But really, Ramus's main point is this. God, in this case, for him, God gave us two gifts. And when I say us, I mean humans. Two gifts: speech and reason. And apparently, taking a nod from one of his semi-contemporaries, Bacon, I almost said Kevin Bacon, that would have been awkward, Sir Francis Bacon, he says, that if you have these two things, they're separate from each other. They are two separate gifts from God. So there's no link between speech and reason. And therefore, he says there's no link between rhetoric and reason. Oh, fascinating. That's beautiful. So anybody who practices rhetoric is not saying anything worthwhile because it's not reasoned. Reason and science are for the purview of the philosophers and the scientists. Does this sound familiar to anybody? It sounds familiar to me. A little bit Platonistic, I think. And he also says that, therefore, we should divide the canons of rhetoric up. And those canons should now be divided, such as reason is invention and arrangement. And some people throw memory in there. It depends on what interpretation of Ramus that you read. But for my argument, I'm going to say invention and arrangement. Nope, I'm going to include memory. I'm going to include memory in that. My interpretation is that memory is in reason. And I mean, I just disagree with this premise from the get-go, so it's not really important. But the second side, which is speech, is style and delivery. So literally, Peter Ramus is the reason why rhetoric has a bad reputation. Thanks, Peter. I don't really like this guy very much, though he entertains me. He was run out on rails pretty much out of the town on the massacre of St. Bartholomew, I believe, was that the one that he was killed in. And he was murdered for his ideas. I mean, which I don't think anybody should be, but he was trying to undercut every single sort of foundational philosophy we had regarding rhetoric, which at the time was one of the 5 R's. Well, there were like 12 of them. But one of the definitely the liberal arts. So, there's now 7 liberal arts. Rhetoric is actually included in that. They don't call it that, but back in the time of the medieval period, and actually prior to that, in Rome, of course, we know that Cicero and Quintilian said that the education system can't exist without rhetoric being a firm part of that, being a foundational part of that. Now we read, we write, and that's it. And reading and writing has now become rote grammar, right? And spelling words. Whereas rhetoric is about critically analyzing those and looking for meaning or creating meaning. So they were teaching that way back then. And he said, whoa, let's divide these things up. And the people of his academic period just like revolted against him and said no. They did try a couple times to bring him into the foray. They made him the chair of law, I think, instead, or something like that. But man, he was not a happy camper ever. I think he bathed like once a year. He had some really weird habits. Most of these philosophers do, by the way. These theorists are a little weird. But the third, so he divides, or he tells us the 2 gifts that we get from God, speech and reason. He divides the canons up into speech and reason. And then the third thing that he does that's really important is he says that Quintilian's definition of rhetoric is really bad. Now, Quintilian gives us a definition of the perfect orator, right? He doesn't actually say all rhetoric is this, although I think that's his implication, which is to say that that a good orator, a good practitioner of rhetoric, a good rhetor, is a good person speaking well. And so at that point, Quintilian really brings ethics into it and says, you can't just be a good speaker, but you have to be a good person too. Now, this sounds familiar. It sounds very much like Aristotle, And, Ramus hated that. He said the biggest reason he didn't like it was because it made the definition overbroad. Okay, it was way too wide of a net for the definition. And here's some of his examples. He says at one point, we don't, take an artist who is a painter and judge him by the poetry that he writes. Probably not. We don't take someone who is particularly good at architecture and judge them by their oil paintings. This is just not something we do. And here he is saying that the ability to craft an argument and then to deliver that argument, those are 2 separate things. And the ability to be a good person and to also practice rhetoric are 2 different things. Now, there's some reasoning behind this argument that I can get behind. For example, it is true that I have seen many people claim that they practice rhetoric, right? That's what they're doing. They're trying to persuade us about some social issue, a debatable moral issue, perhaps, and they're practicing rhetoric, but they themselves are not good people, okay? We could see that, and it does happen. Aristotle would say those people are not practicing rhetoric because if they would, their goodwill towards their audience would make them inherently ethical and good. So you can't use rhetoric for nefarious means if you're not a good person. Ramus says that's ridiculous. Of course, a bad person can use rhetoric for nefarious means. Myself, Quintilian, Aristotle, we all believe that the first part of rhetoric is having the right intentions towards the audience, to not mislead them, to give them as much information as they need to make a good decision, to not coerce, to allow them to know, to have confidence that the entire bit of speech that you're giving is honest and truthful, and the whole of what they need to know in order to accept your speech and to use that information wisely. For example, the one that we use a lot, and I apologize, I'm looking down at my phone. The one that we use a lot is the idea of, what if you give a speech, like in your 115 class, about encouraging everybody to exercise, and everybody goes and they exercise, or you have a 15% return rate, right? 15% of the class goes and exercises, and they like get on a treadmill and they start sweating and working themselves up. And the next thing you know, one of them drops dead. And the reason that they dropped dead is because they had some sort of heart condition that they did not know about. And, this aggravated that, and they fall over dead, right? That's bad. Is that a bad intention? No. But what could we have done to make sure that that didn't happen? And the answer is always the same. We give them that preamble, right? Like the first thing that you do before you exercise is consult your doctor, right? That's why they always say that before, or at the end of all commercials for medications, for supplements, for exercise machine, etc. First, talk to your doctor. Make sure that you have all the information that you need to make a decision that's good for you. Because if it's not good for you to go run on a treadmill, I don't want to encourage you to do so. If you can run on a treadmill, here are the really good reasons why you should, or whatever argument it is that you're making, right? And so Ramus says that, anytime somebody wants to use rhetoric, it's usually for nefarious means. It's to lie. It's to use flowery, empty language with no meaning. Oh, that sounds familiar. Yes. Again, the reason that rhetoric has a bad reputation is because of Peter Ramus. I am never going to let that go. It's true. And you're like, but he's like in the 1500s, Dr. Dash. And I'm like, yeah, it's had a bad reputation for a really long time. This is why people have sometimes come to me and they said, my boss wants to know why I'm taking a class in lying. It's so hard to get rid of this bad reputation that rhetoric has. Even when they talk about like presidential candidates or any political stuff, they say, well, that's just a bunch of rhetoric. Well, of course it is. We're debating a moral issue in the public, a social issue. Yes, that's exactly what that is. So for some reason, Ramus, for these three reasons, sort of argues against the idea of rhetoric being a way to find truth, to reason out the truth, to anticipate that it has any value beyond sounding pretty, being aesthetically pleasing, etc. So that's Peter Ramus. Hopefully you got all of that. The three main ideas for why he thinks rhetoric is bad is probably the most important thing. And knowing that Quintilian's definition for him was overbroad. And those are the things that you really need to know. I love talking about Peter Ramus, in case you can't tell. Now, during this time, I told you there was going to be a debate between rhetoric, reason, and the aesthetic, right? Like in the classical Greeks, we had rhetoric versus truth, or rhetoric versus philosophy. During the Roman period, classical Romans, we had rhetoric and power. During the medieval period, we had rhetoric against, basically the church. And then during the Renaissances, we really start to develop this triumvirate of three pillars of things that we're debating. Is rhetoric an art, or is it a science? And the answer to that question is, by the way, in case you're curious, both or neither. We'll see. So that moves us on to Francis Bacon, and that's pretty exciting because I don't know if you know this, but I think this is true. I mean, somebody told me this, and I trust them, but apparently Francis Bacon's mother's maiden name was Cooke, Cooke. And so that's correct. His full name would have been, at that time, Sir Francis Cooke Bacon. Not a bad name. Elizabeth Cooke Bacon. I'm good with that, Seems like a good name. Anyway, I have no idea if that's true or not, but it's kind of a cool way to remember Bacon, because here's the thing. Bacon was, if nothing else, a scientist who was trying to grapple with the idea of the aesthetic. And that makes sense because cooking, if you pull back to your Aristotle and your Plato, was one of those skills that they talked about that rhetoric should not be compared to. But I'm going to do it with bacon because bacon's a beautiful thing. The food, right? Bacon is fantastic. Everybody loves it. Secret, by the way, I don't like bacon. I know, that's weird. Shh. Making sure my husband doesn't hear me. Making sure the leopard geckos don't tell on me, I guess. He loves it, right? Most people love bacon. And it's really bad for you. Like, in so many ways, it's bad for you. The only thing worse is like a pork rind, right? Like, I mean, this is not good stuff for you. It's not healthy. However, some people say that if you put it on a hamburger the right way, or you put it into a carbonara the right way, that you have the perfect meal, right? It's art. It's so good. It tastes so good. It's art. Okay, well, there's a science to making that happen. There's a list of ingredients. There's an order of going about it to make bacon, especially if you're like making honey maple bacon or something very, very special, right? Or you're putting that bacon into a sauce or into potatoes or whatever. There's certain ways to cook the bacon, etc. Have I gone on enough? I'm Italian. I could start talking about prosciutto, which is really just raw bacon, but hey, who cares, right? So Bacon, as in Francis Bacon, was the same way. Because if he's nothing else, he was in fact a scientist. In fact, I don't know if you know this, those of you who have heard about the scientific method, you know that it is in fact deductive, right? We start with a hypothesis and then we test it on specific instances to see if it is in fact true, or in how many cases it's true, right? Well, that actually is born out of the Baconian method. And the Baconian method was inductive. And it's what we used to use. It's what we used to call the scientific method. I say we as if I was alive when that happened. It really was that way probably until the 1800s. So 1900s, somewhere in there, early 1900s. I'm going to have to go through like early 1900s was when it really shifted. But the Baconian method of science was inductive. You go out and you do a bunch of things to something and see what happens. And then you draw a conclusion from that. Okay. So one of my favorite stories about Bacon is how he died. Bacon decided that he wanted to know if you could freeze poultry to store it, right? Now, at the time, I thought it was a chicken. It apparently was maybe a goose, possibly another farm fowl animal that I have fear of. It's irrational, but I have it. But he, something along those lines that they would have eaten back then, a turkey, a goose, more than a chicken. Anyway, he took it. He picked it up off the side of the road, according to the story of the friend who took this trip with him. And then he buried it in the snow. And he would go out and check on it at these periodic times. Now, it would be funny if he caught salmonella and died, but nope, that's not what happened. He actually got cold, caught pneumonia, and died because, well, you don't catch pneumonia from the cold, but his immune system decreased and he caught pneumonia and he died. And so, for the sake of science, Bacon literally put his life on the line and lost. But he, prior to that, had done several different studies with this method of setting up these different experiences with, take poultry, put in like 5 pieces of poultry or 5 different birds into the snow and see if you can preserve it and find out what happens to them every hour, every day, or whatever it is that he did. Okay. And so that Baconian method was inductive scientific method. And the scientific method, as we use it today, is deductive. Supposedly. We could talk about that another day. Like if you go into grad school, let's have a talk about that. Okay. So it's deductive in the scientific method. And Bacon was nothing if not a scientist, as I said. So when the idea of rhetoric came along, he was a little bit confused about what to do with that. And we see that play out in the 2 works that you have looked at. Now, Bacon had come up with the idea of faculty psychology, the idea that the brain could be divided into all these different parts and you were born with a certain talent or a set of talents. Okay. I don't know if you've ever heard somebody say, I wasn't in line when they gave out patience. right? Before I was born, I wasn't in line for patience. I wasn't in line for piano playing or music at all. I have no ability with music. I can't sing. My piano teacher, when I was younger, after 3 years, said, go back to playing softball. It was bad. But I enjoy music. I appreciate the artistic side of music, but that does not make me a musician. So I don't have that talent, or I don't have that faculty. Did you ever hear somebody say, I've lost all my faculties to feel anything? REM had a great song out called Losing My Religion. Now, I know I'm digging way back here, but at least it's more modern than Bacon, right? REM's idea of losing my religion, losing my mind, being scattered, not knowing what to do, losing all social grace. Well, all of those things were faculties. They were talents, they were skills, faculties, things that the brain made it possible for you to do. This is why in the 1950s, by the way, they thought if a woman was hysterical, her problem was that she was hysterical because usually because of her menstrual cycle and how it messed with her brain. So what did they do? They cut out a portion of their brain. It was called a lobotomy. You guys have heard that term, I'm sure. And you all probably know that they're performed on women for the most part. I don't know of any men that they tried this on because it was mainly used to treat hysteria. You know, any woman who changes her mind is clearly hysterical. So, and just that word hysterical, hysterectomy. Okay. It was National Women's Day yesterday. I'll just go out on the feminist tip here for a second and say that that's where those words come from. Okay. In the Latin, that's where they originate from. I'm not making any judgment there. So, but the lobotomy took out a portion of the brain. It was the portion of the brain dealing with short-term memory for the purpose of getting rid of this bad faculty, this failed talent or skill. Okay. So Bacon's at fault for that. Just kidding. It's not just him. It was a lot of people who bought into this idea that he had, meaning that you had to be born with the skill of rhetoric for him. The power of speech, the ability to put an argument together, reasoning, all of those were different faculties for Bacon. And he says that we're born with some of them, but not all of them. And so that's what your first piece is about. When you're reading about on this, I almost said on the study methods of our time, that is incorrect. When you're reading about, it's not Novum Organum because that's the other one. Can't remember the name of this first piece. Somebody can help me out, or I can look it up. Don't you hate when that kind of stuff happens? Probably doesn't happen to you all anymore. An essay concerning, nope, that's Locke. Let's go back a little bit. Here we go. The advancement of learning. They all named things almost the same. It's just all runs together after a while. In the advancement of learning, he's trying to learn or express how he thinks that the brain learns. Okay? And that's where we get faculty psychology. Now, that's interesting because if you're born with a talent for rhetoric, then that would mean that we'd all know how to understand it, or at least most of us would be able to understand it as well as perform it or study it or teach it or whatever it is that you view it as. And that's obviously not true. Cicero talks about, yes, you may be born with the talent, but if you don't hone that talent, if you don't use it, if you don't make it better, it's not going to be okay later. It's like if somebody was born with the ability to be a pianist, like my brother, he has what they call piano fingers, those really like long fingers on a hand. Mine are very short and stubby, and not just because I don't have nails, but because I have like shorter hands. He has those very long, thin fingers. The idea that you could reach across multiple keys without having to move your whole hand, right? Those are called piano fingers. Well, great, he has those. But he never got past Peter Pumpkin Eater on the piano. And it's not like he could sit down and just start playing, I don't know, Clair de Lune or something, Moonlight Sonata all of a sudden, Rhapsody in Blue, all of a sudden, because he happens to have those fingers, which suggest that he should have a talent for it. He has zero musical talent, just like me. I think it skipped my entire family. No kidding. So my mom played piano and the flute. My aunt played piano and the piccolo. And my brother Patrick played the clarinet. And I'm sure they were all very good at that. But none of us sing. None of us can do any of that stuff. Unlike my father, who was in a band in the 1960s. Good for him. We just got none of that talent. And I'm sure they were very excellent because they were a garage band in the 1960s. And needless to say, he became a lawyer. And do you hear about him now? No, you don't. You know why? Because while he may have had a certain talent for singing and for playing when he was in the 1960s, he was in his late teens and early 20s, fantastic, but it didn't carry forward for him. It was not a talent that was honed at all. And so other talents were honed, other faculties were used. And so when we talk about the advancement of learning, we're talking about how is it that the brain learns? Okay. Which leads us to the second and more interesting piece that we have from Francis Bacon, which of course is known as Novum Organum. And Novum Organum literally translates to new instrument. And here he's talking about a new way of understanding how we accept truth, we learn. Okay. It goes along with that first piece because while we search for truth, we can't always get there. We can't see the whole truth. Nobody can. Why? Because according to Bacon, we are distracted by 4 idols. IDOLS, much like in the Bible and the story of the golden calf, or the idea of false idols that literally they are a distraction from the one true God. Well, in this case, just think about the idols distracting from truth. However you get there, however you find it, if science is the way to truth, these distract us from it. And what are those 4 things? Well, we have the idol of the cave or the den. I don't know which translation you guys got. There is the idol of the tribe. There is the idol of the theater. And there is the idol of the marketplace. Now, what the hell does that mean? Well, these are 4 ways that we are limited in our knowledge and limited in finding the truth. The first, the cave or the den, is literally you yourself. We are limited by who we are, what we're willing to accept, what we're willing to reject, whether or not we're willing to change our mind or our attitude or our view of something. Whether or not we're willing to learn more about something or ask the right questions, we ourselves limit ourselves. And I don't know about you, but there are times when I'm sitting on my couch and like literally we've had cable since, well, we've always had cable, but I mean, we didn't hook it up. So like ever, we had the boxes sitting in my living room forever. Mainly because we have YouTube and all these other services, Hulu and Netflix I could just live on, and we had all these other apps that we didn't need cable, but we've been paying for it because it's a bundle, right? Of course. So finally this weekend I was like, I really want to like watch some old Law and Order. I want to check out. And my husband's like, okay. So we he goes, I'll go to the TV downstairs. I'm like, oh, okay. So, we suffer here. We've got 2 huge TVs with cable on them now. It's hard being me, I guess. But now I find that I'm sitting here most of the time, and instead of doing what I should be doing, which is spending my energy on something like this, as opposed to blankly staring at my screen as I watch, an episode of Law and Order Criminal Intent, and I don't even like Criminal Intent, but I'm watching it anyway because it's on, right? We don't want to take the time to truly study what is right in front of us. I do not care how this computer is working right now. I'm glad it works, but I don't have the motivation to ask the question of why. So that is at least one tiny little limitation that you have coming from me, right? And that's from in here. Another limitation or idol, distraction, is the idol of the tribe. And here he's using the word tribe to represent all of humanity. Okay, we all belong to the human race. Most of us. Okay, and what is the human race limited by? Oh my God, time, the ability to see. Remember, I mean, we've gotten telescopes and microscopes, since the time of Bacon. We don't do those things. Those are instruments that we've used to help us see things that are more true than others. In order to see the truth, human beings are limited by, our ability to read as many articles as we can. We can't read everything, right? We can't watch everything. We can't know everything. And we certainly don't have the time to go out and run experiments on everything to make sure that we know the truth. I don't know about you, but I don't have the time to go on an African safari. Although right now it sounds safer, right? Malaria instead of COVID. I don't know. I'm just saying. We don't have the time to do everything that we want to do. So we have to pick and choose. So we are limited as human beings. And all human beings are limited by some of these things or all of these things. The next thing is the idol of the theater. And what do we mean by that? The theater is where we live, where we exist, where we look for truth, where we look for knowledge. And the theater is everything that's going on around us and how it distracts us from the truth. It's our culture. It's the things that make us not want to do certain things because of how we were raised or because of the things that we believe or what feels good and what doesn't feel good. What we're told is right and what we're told is wrong. For example, my grandfather was born in 1913, and he died in 2013. So I know that sounds like a long freaking time ago to you, but to me, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, not that long. I remember talking to him, obviously, and hanging out with him since he died in my late 30s. But he would tell me these stories, and he had these ideas. And one of those ideas was that I should not be in college. So when I went on and got my PhD and started teaching, it really blew his mind, right? Like, no woman should be doing that, even his granddaughter. Why? Why did he think that? Well, obviously, you're born in 1913. You were raised on the farm. You knew your family had money because you were allowed to take one of the horses to school and back because you could afford it. I mean, literally, that was my grandfather's life. So his idea of who should and should not do things, they were really, the word old-fashioned doesn't even begin. Right? Now, he worked his way around. He was very proud of me. When Obama became president, that's a whole other discussion, right? That did not go over well at all. But for him. But he got over it. My mom is getting over some things that she's still trapped in. I would say that she doesn't really understand the gay transgender issue, but she's coming around to that one. I'm not sure why, but she's getting better about it, which is great. I've got no complaints about that. I think everybody should be more open-minded. Race was a big deal for my father until he met my sister's friend who was white and her husband was black, and they had a little baby together. And at that time, we referred to them as mixed races. And my dad met this little boy and fell in love with Cameron, fell in love with him. And all of a sudden, it was okay that black and white people were together having babies. Fantastic. They were open to coming to terms with these things. I would never think to have a problem with those things. You might not think to have a problem with those things. And my mom, oh my God, you know what she's got caught up on? She can't get rid of this idea that mental health should not be talked about, that that's an embarrassment. So in her perfect world, nobody would research or get to know or understand mental illness. Are you kidding me? I mean, I've got like 3. Seriously. Anybody have an anxiety problem? Yeah, that's me. I have an anxiety problem. I'm not talking about a fear of public speaking. I'm talking about like a true anxiety problem, right? And so if we didn't study it, if we didn't understand it, I wouldn't be able to deal with it. And she's like, don't talk about that. And here's how exactly she says it, by the way. Don't talk about that, Beth Ann. That's not okay. So her worldview is a little bit weird to me. I don't completely understand it, but it's from everything she's been taught, everything that she's been told, how her parents raised her, the fact that she was raised by people who were technically older when they had her because they were in their 30s. The Catholic Church has impact on her a great deal. So all of these things feed into her to limit her ability to ask the right questions or to ask any questions at all or to find answers because you don't want to know the answers, right? I go to the doctor all the time. I have 4 autoimmune diseases, right? That'll give you an anxiety problem just right there, just hearing that, right? So I have 4 autoimmune diseases. I'm trying to manage them on a regular basis, and that's difficult to do, but I have like 12 doctors. 9 of them are in Denver. Okay, so I see specialists. I'm constantly getting blood work done. I know things about my body nobody should know. I know what my CO2 level is on a regular basis. Why do we care? I know what my blood calcium reading is. If you're diabetic like me, you know exactly what your glucose is at any given time. These kinds of things, my mother would never go get checked because, and I quote, if you don't look under the hood, there can't be anything wrong with the car. Now, if that sounds like flawed reasoning to you, that's because it is flawed. And it is limited by the cultural and social sort of expectations that she lives under, right? So all of that distracts her. That is the idol of the theater. Finally, the idol of the marketplace. Well, what is it that you need in a marketplace? If you want to buy something, you need money. So if you want to understand, there has to be some sort of exchange. And how is it that we exchange ideas? Is we communicate with language. So language is the currency of the marketplace. And we are all limited by language, right? We'll talk more about that when we get to John Locke. But here we're really talking about how language limits us from understanding the whole of truth. How do you describe a lilac? Or the smell of lavender, or anything else purple? How do you describe the word purple? We are limited by our language, by the number of things that we have to say, the amount of words that we have to describe something, our ability to describe it, to be complete in that description, and to not bleed over into other meanings. So language really screws us up, which I think all of us knew, which is why we study it most of the time, right? You're all communication majors, I'm pretty sure still. All right, so that leads us to, I don't know why I have modern rhetoric and I have Fell here. That is just wrong. She is in the wrong place here, but she was way at the end of the Enlightenment and towards the beginning of modernity, I guess, but definitely not modern. I think I was ahead of myself there when I wrote Intro to Modern Language, or Modern Rhetoric, excuse me. But Fell, we know, was a woman who was married to a judge. Her father was very rich, and she inherited all the land. But back then, women weren't allowed to inherit land, so she married Judge Fell so that he could maintain the land. And then Judge Fell died, and she married a guy named Fox. And Fox was someone that she was introduced to much earlier. She hosted him at her house because he was a preacher, and she loved what he was preaching. And she brought all of her friends and neighbors together in her hall, her grand hall of her massive home. And he would preach the ideas that later became the Circle of Friends and Puritanism, or not Puritanism. Wow, I really need help. Quakerism. And Quakerism and Puritanism are not the same thing, but the idea of Quakerism. And she would go to jail for a short while because she refused to swear on the Bible, which the Quakers did not do. Anyway, Margaret decided to take up the cause of women speaking in church. Now, this was not women going out into the town square and talking. That's considered bad and dirty and not something for a woman to do. Besides, they're not reasonable enough. But she does want to talk about why women should be allowed to speak in the church. So she takes up that cause and she writes this piece, Women Speaking Justified. And in it, she uses the main source as the Bible. She tells these stories of the women in the Bible. You know, the old joke used to be, Jesus had man had nothing to do with us being saved. Mary and God got together and had Jesus. Man had nothing to do with it. That sort of said tongue in cheek. She sort of uses, and she doesn't use that argument, obviously, but she uses the argument that God used women to spread the news of Jesus's resurrection, that he uses Mary Magdalene. There's some books written by some women in the Bible. And although those are more Old Testament, she uses Old Testament and New Testament to prove that women should be allowed to speak in the church because God used women in the Bible to speak for him. And therefore it should be okay. It's a compelling argument. I have a great appreciation for it, but it's a very limited audience. But she is, she was the founder of the Circle of Friends, and Quakerism along with, Fox, and that's their whole story. If you read her piece, why am I saying there? If you read her piece and you have more questions about it, feel free to ask me. All right, moving on to, now we're getting towards the modern. We're not really there yet, but we're getting there. John Locke and an essay on human understanding. John Locke, of course, is known as the social philosopher, the idea of social contract. But here he's writing about how we come to know and what role language has in that. So keep in mind, again, truth and the relationship to rhetoric. It's still a question. Of course, he takes a much more interesting approach, I guess we could say, because he was not a philosopher of rhetoric or of words or of language. He was a social contract philosopher of law. He was, more interested in human relationships as they work to build a society. But in this particular piece, he writes about 4 problems with language. Well, first of all, he says there's two different kinds of language for the most part. I look at them as internal and external. That is to say, the kind of language that we use on ourselves or internally, and the meaning that we have there, and then the meaning that we have, when we talk to someone else, because they receive a different meaning. So already language is messed up. Kind of like my hair. I look like a rooster right now. I don't know what happened. I had it all gelled up earlier. Faux hawks. You gotta know how to wear them. And so he was really about, trying to figure out what the relationship was between language and meaning and how it messed it up. And the answer was a lot of different ways. But he has 4 main arguments for why we misunderstand each other, why we don't communicate well with each other. Those 4 reasons are, number 1, concepts and ideas are too complex to be contained by words or represented by words. So words are trying to represent ideas that are way too complex for them to represent. Next, there can be one word with many meanings. Third, there can be many words with the same meaning. And then I believe he lists this first, but and I'm listing it last. It's certainly not in any order here, but this is probably the most important one. There's no natural relationship between a word and its object. Tree is not tree because it's a tree. A tree is a tree because someone decided to call it that, right? Somebody decided to call a television a television. These are arbitrarily assigned by humans. We decide the names of things. I mean, my goodness, do you really think that my leopard gecko Cicero knows he's named Cicero? No. They hear a certain sound of your voice and they come running. Yeah, seriously, my leopard geckos will come to their name, except Loki. He runs like the wind. And some of you may have pets that you talk to and, you're thinking, oh, I'm communicating with that pet. I mean, I used to talk to my cats all the time, right? But really what it is they're responding to the sound. Do they know their dogs? Probably not, because humans are the only ones who assign meaning to words the way that we do. Okay. So those are the 4 problems that we have. And he has one solution to it. And that one solution is purification. Purification of the language. If we just got the language down to so many words that we agreed that had that meaning, we would be better off. And thus the birth of the dictionary. Okay. And here we really get an explanation of what denotative and connotative meaning is. And I know you all think it's the same thing. Denotative is the dictionary meaning, and connotative is the context. That's not really it. What is a dictionary? A dictionary is a book that outlines the things, excuse me, goodness. It tells us the agreed upon meanings of words. We agree that bling, excuse me, now means sparkly objects. Boy, that's some bling she's got on today. Nope, not blingy. Just huge and obnoxiously red. Even my engagement ring is not blingy. It's very small, right? We all agree that bling means something shiny. Well, back in my day, bling kind of meant the sound that a phone made, right? But we, in the dictionary, they always say Merriam-Webster has added the new word of the year, whatever that is. I mean, when they put ain't in the dictionary, my grandmother lost her mind, right? And over time it changes, but we have this agreed upon idea of what it means. Now, that has changed in the past couple of years because you all have developed this thing called the Urban Dictionary. I say you all, like I'm not at fault. I was obviously your age when these things started. Okay, I was a little older than you. Who can I blame? I'm going to blame my brother. Yeah, Patrick. All of those people, but those who are like 6 to 8 years behind me, started this idea of the Urban Dictionary, right? And I have to look up there all the time. Somebody literally said to me the other day, I hope I'm not being a PETA. And it was capital P, capital I, capital T, capital A. I was like, what the freaking hell is a PETA? It's something I put my euros in. I don't understand what you're talking about. And so I asked my friend, I said, hey, Jeannie, what the hell's PETA? As in, I hope I'm not being a PETA. She goes, oh, crap, I have no idea. Hold on. She goes and asks her daughter, who was 14, and she says, Abigail, what the heck is PETA? And she goes, pain in the ass? And so Gina comes back to me, she goes, pain in the ass? And I'm like, oh, yeah, I knew that. Pain in the ass. Like, come on, are you kidding me? Why do we need to shorten pain in the ass to PETA? But we do, and it's in the Urban Dictionary, so clearly it's a conversation piece out there. And there is a language that is, there are multiple languages, subcultural languages, as well as, whole entire different languages like Spanish or something. But he's talking about meaning even when we're all speaking the same language. Why is it that meaning is different? So we have this agreed upon definition of things. That's the denotative meaning. Okay, yes, usually it's represented in the dictionary because the dictionary is where we know what we've agreed to. Okay, and then you have the connotative, which is not contextual. It's more cultural. It's a subculture, co-culture, culture, country. It doesn't matter. It is a meaning that's impacted by culture. One of those words is a word that we are actually going to be using coming up here by Kenneth Burke, which is called consubstantiality, which in the Catholic Church, if you are Catholic or know someone who's Catholic, they might have mentioned this to you. They've started using that word, consubstantial. They've put it into some of the prayers. I wouldn't have been able to say that when I was like 8, so kind of glad it wasn't there then. But that idea of consubstantiality means something completely different in church, in a Catholic church, as it does in the social world. It's just a different idea about it, of what it means. So when we get there, you'll understand that word in its context and out of its context, but in its culture, how it changes meaning. It doesn't just go away. No words just go away. I remember when I was very young, I say very young, I was like 8. So that's pretty young, right? When I was like 8, the word bad changed. So, we go around, we say, oh man, that's really good. That is so good. Well, back then, Michael Jackson came out and we're like, dude, that's so good, it's bad, right? So then we just started saying, dude, that's bad. And I remember them making jokes about it, like in Ghostbusters and other movies. Like, I'm a little confused about this whole good, bad thing. Good, bad, bad, bad. I don't understand. And that's kind of the way I felt the first time a student said to me, Dr. Dudash, that is so sick. I was like, what the freaking hell is sick? I had to figure that one out on my own. And so this was before Urban Dictionary was online, I guess. And so words don't go away, but they may change meaning, not just in different cultures or subcultures or co-cultures, but they may change meaning over time and within those cultures and co-cultures and coexisting everything. They don't disappear. They gain a different meaning. All right. And there's power in that. We're going to talk about that in the future. Today is not that day. I'm going to try to wrap up. I don't like having videos that are more than like 30 minutes long, and we're at an hour. I'm going to wrap up, I think, with Vico. He's our next guy. And maybe I'll say something about the other 4, because I really want to get us into week 9. That's really where I want to get us to, because we're going to be there very quickly. So stick with me just a little bit longer. Along comes Vico. Vico addresses his work, I'm so dry, addresses his work specifically to Francis Bacon. I believe he says in the first line or in the second paragraph, my dear Sir Francis Bacon. He is responding directly to On the Study Methods of Our Time, but or not On the Study Methods of Our Time. That's the name of Vico's work. In On the Study Methods of Our Time by Vico, he is really focusing less on the advancement of learning, more on Novum Organum, to explore this idea of, are the new methods and contraptions and things that we have, really, do they bring us closer to the truth? Is this the best way to get at the truth, the modern way? Or is it the old-fashioned way, the old way from the classical Greeks, the classical Romans? Did they know better how to discover truth than they did in Vico and Bacon's time? I mean, we could ask the same question now. Were they better at finding truth in the classical Greek and Roman times than we are now, with all of our contraptions and our machines and all these things that tell us specific numbers? I said I'm diabetic. I wake up in the morning and I've got a little machine that tells me what kind of day I'm going to have because of the number that's on the machine. If that number is wrong, I'm probably going to have a problem later on in the day. So you have to make sure that your equipment is working properly so that it represents the truth properly, so that you can interpret it properly. How close to the truth are we? That is the question that Vico's asking, really. Excuse me. Now, Vico goes through this debate between the current study methods of his time and of the classical, ancient methods of getting to know something, of learning truth. He goes through this debate. He goes back and forth. If you've read it, you know that it can be confusing at times, but ultimately he sets up the question, who was better at finding truth, us or them? And he comes to the conclusion that it was them. And he has a very good reason why. Actually, several reasons. Number one, certainty. They didn't have it. And we were claiming to have it all the time. We know for sure that you can freeze poultry. Bacon taught us that. We know for sure that the stars are aligned a certain way because we have telescopes. We know for sure that the earth is round. Do we? Do we? I'm just kidding. Of course we do. But back then, it was a little bit more questionable, wasn't it? I mean, how much do we know because we are certain of it? And how many times does that blow up in our face? Being someone who is, constantly, like I said, dealing with hospitals and doctors and just trying to stay alive is sometimes a real difficulty, right? I mean, right now I'm doing okay, right? Hey, I talk about a little bit about brain fog, but any of us could have that, right? When I was in college and I was healthy, but I was smoking 2 packs a day and drinking a lot. I don't do either of those things anymore. And I slept like 3 hours a night. Not smart, by the way. If you're someone who does that, like doesn't sleep, like you're sleep deprived, I felt like I was sharp as a tack. I'm pretty sure my 2.77 GPA reflects a different reality. Right. But the fact of the matter is that what we believe we are certain of, once we say we're certain of this, we don't keep asking questions. We don't keep searching for more truth. And that, according to Vico, is our biggest fault. Another reason why they were better than we were was not just because they still asked questions, but because they were more about the ethical nature of it. That is to say, the ethos of truth. Where did it come from? How did we get there? The idea of how we got to the truth was just as important as whatever truth it is we think we learned. So uncertainty and a certain ethic about the truth, those two things he felt were present in the ancients and not in the modern times, due to, just the fact that humans started thinking we knew more than we did. Now, there's an underlying thing here that's going on, and that is the humanists. The humanists really, I think I've described before that the humanists were not called humanists because they believed they were better than God, but because they believed that humans can contribute to knowing the truth, that it doesn't just come from God, it doesn't just come from science, but it comes from our understanding, our interpretation of what we're seeing, tasting, smelling, whatever it is, empirically. The humanists came along and said, hey, wait, we don't have to get that truth from God. We can find that ourselves. We know what we are feeling, what we are seeing, what we are smelling, what we're tasting and hearing, and so on. So that idea was coming up, and Vico kind of wanted to push us away from, again, that certainty of what you're seeing is not necessarily the whole truth or the full truth. And that goes back to Bacon's limitations. And Vico really, was like, yeah, we're limited, all right. We're limited to the point that we can't really claim the level of truth or certainty with the truth that we think that we can. And we should go back to the ancient Greeks and understand that constant questioning, that constant dialectical tension that we want to work with consistently is what gets us to a better level of knowledge and better level of truth. All right, so that's Vico. And next up on the hit list, that sounds really bad when I say that. It just hit me. Where I come from, a hit list is not like a mob who I'm going to kill, like in what order. That's not what I mean. Hit list was like, all right, what musical numbers are like the top 10? Let's play the hits. So whenever I say next up on the hit list, that's what I'm talking about. I wanted to clarify that. I don't know why. All right, so let's talk about Sheridan and Blair together. Sheridan and Blair were what we call the elocutionists. They were, Sheridan was more about elocution. Blair was more about the belletristic movement. Now you'll see on there it says the bellettes. The bellettes were beautiful letters. And of course, elocution, as we know, is the way which something is delivered. More often than not, the nonverbal actions that you take to enhance your speech. Right. I mean, for example, yeah, people actually study this crap. You don't actually, when you're talking, say, I went up the stairs and then I came back down. That's not how we work, up the stairs, down the stairs, not the opposite direction. Right. It's kind of like, it reminds me of that speech from, oh God, who is it? I'm trying to think of who did a speech recently, not this past year, but in 2016, about up and down and left and right and just side to side or whatever it was. I don't remember. I think it was Giuliani, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, at the RNC in 2016. Something along those lines of just not getting it right. The nonverbal motions did not match the words that we were using. And there's entire books, elocution studies, that give you like positions that your arms and legs should be in, exactly like a ballet book. If you're a dancer, you know that your feet go into certain positions, such as first position, fifth position, etc., where your feet are going a certain direction and your arms are matching that direction in order to achieve a particular demonstration of meaning through dance. Well, the same thing when you're speaking. Your nonverbals should actually enhance your verbals. They shouldn't just be there to distract people. We're not all Italian. I am. I get to do it. I'm just kidding. And how funny how we let ourselves pick on our own kind. I'm Italian. It's okay if I say that. Not okay if you say that, if you're not Italian. That's weird. But, I am one of those consummate Italians that, as they talk about the stereotype of talking with my hands. But I'm literally not creating any meaning with my hands. They're just going. They're distraction. Okay. Obviously, elocution is the study of how to make your movements help your audience understand your speech, not just as a distraction. The belletristic movement and the ballets are all about taste. They're all about being in good taste, about social graces. And how do you get good tastes? Well, according to Blair, you are born with it because you're rich, or you become rich, that idea of nouveau riche. I'm sure you've heard that term. And you rub elbows with the people who have good taste, and you never get to have great taste, but you get to have better taste than when you didn't have money. I guess this is why Paris Hilton had such a really good, job of just being beautiful back in the early 2000s. Of course, I've been reading a lot more about her. I used to make fun of it, but I actually really appreciate her a great deal. I don't think I'll ever have an appreciation for Taylor Swift, but I definitely have an appreciation for Paris Hilton that I never did. But because she came from money, what she picked and what she said was good and what she said was hot and all those other things were the things that we believed were hot and good and cool. All those things because somebody rich said it. Was it really in great taste to be half naked on a car with a burger grease dripping down your chin? Probably not. And yet there was that Hardee's commercial. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you're way too young. I feel like like I said, I get older, you guys stay the same age, and all of my examples go out the window within a year or two. All right. Last but not least, let me talk about George Campbell, and Richard Whately. Campbell and Whately were really more about reason and science and the effect of language on those two than Sheridan and Blair. Sheridan and Blair were totally about the aesthetic, right? But Whately and Campbell and Whately were really more about reasoning and about science. So let me talk about that briefly. Campbell, in the Philosophy of Rhetoric, really talks about the two kinds of argument that we have. According to him, we have deductive, and intuitive. Not inductive, intuitive. So it's sort of a deductive, that which we reason out, and intuitive, that which comes from common sense. And rhetoric belongs in the deductive when we're talking about things that there isn't a scientific answer for, but things which are debatable. Okay, so for example, we're not talking about, is the sun going to rise tomorrow, or is the sky blue? That's not worth debating. But what is worth debating is whether or not we should have public law on health, right? The mask debate is right up the alley of a moral social debate that we have at a grand level. But Campbell was really talking about this more like people like him, people who were educated. The academy should be able to make those debates happen. Those don't belong in the common discourse, the public discourse. They belong with those who have been trained to talk about them. So from Campbell, we really get the two kinds of argument, intuitive and deductive. And in deductive, there is sort of the scientific debate and there is the moral debate. And rhetoric is in the realm of argument about morality, about quality, public policy, etc. So that's where rhetoric belongs. Yeah, that's all I need you to get out of George Campbell. Good luck with that. It's actually very clear. He's very clear, but I think that there's a lot of writing around trying to get at that point. So find that point in the piece and really focus on that more than anything else. Okay, last but not least, Whately. Whately was writing about courtroom rhetoric. He was very specific. He was interested in how rhetoric worked in the courtroom. Why? Because if you think about it, you have the stasis system of, we've got this point of stasis between guilt and innocence. And one side argues one thing and one side argues the other. So he developed this idea of presumption and burden of proof. Now you'll notice I did not say presumption of innocence. There's a reason for that. He is writing for the British version. If you've ever watched a British court or, the court in Australia, they function very, very differently than we do. But the one thing that's still the same is that you have these two sides and that they have to argue it out and that somebody has to make a decision about which way the truth goes, right? So Whately, what he did was he introduced the idea of the burden of proof and the idea of presumption. And unlike in the American system, presumption and the burden of proof switch back and forth depending on who spoke last. So you have the guilty, or you have the prosecutor stand up and accuse, you have the defense stand up and defend, and you go back and forth, and the burden of proof and the presumption switches back and forth until the proof has been made and the presumption has been assumed, and now we know what the truth is. You sort of go back and forth answering arguments in the stasis system that you've read in the Rhetorica ad Herennium until we get to this sort of idea of what the truth is. Now, those two concepts, the burden of proof and the presumption, are things that the American system did in fact steal from Whately, not steal, but we use Whately from there, but we don't use it in the same way. Instead, we say that there is a presumption of innocence. So the presumption always falls to the defendant. If you can't find them guilty, then they are definitely innocent. And this, by the way, does not always work out very well for some of us, in the sense that we've put a 14-year-old innocent little boy to death I believe his biggest sin was probably being born black, but he was accused of murder and they put him in the electric chair and they killed him at the ripe age of 14. And here we are 70 years later, we find out that he was innocent. That didn't work out so well. Court system was not great. We didn't do a good job. And 70 years ago, by the way, was not that long ago. I mean, think about it. So you have that, but we also have the other side that happens, which is that there isn't enough evidence to prove that someone is guilty. So they get to walk as if they are innocent, even though they're not. And that's what the presumption of innocence versus the burden of proof does. The burden of proof is always on the prosecution. It's always on the accuser, right? And you have to convince people beyond a reasonable doubt, all right? Which that's the balance there. You've got presumption, which means that the defense is always assumed to be innocent until the prosecution proves that you aren't innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. So while presumption is always on the side of the defense, reasonable doubt is always on the side of the prosecution. They can always try to overcome anything by saying there is no doubt, right? It sounds like it's weighted towards the defense a lot more, but that's probably because American systems don't want to be wrong. We're not cool with that. Some of these places that use the parliamentary system and that court system, which does not force a presumption of innocence on a case, those two things generally occur where they don't have death penalties and things of that nature, where they have coronial hearings as well as the usual legal hearings. So they have a little bit of a different system, but those two concepts of the burden of proof and presumption come from Richard Whately. And now we're into the realm of modern rhetoric, where we're trying to philosophize about the structure of rhetoric, where rhetoric fits in. If it fits in the aesthetic, okay, great. Read your Blair. Read your elocution lessons. But if you believe that it is used to reason and find truth, then read your Whately, read your Campbell. And if you believe that rhetoric leaves the question of can language represent the truth, then read your Locke and your Bacon, right? And your Vico. So that's what I've had for you today. I hope that it was clear. If you have any questions, as always, post them on the discussion board or send me a text. If you do email me, sometimes you have to prod me a little bit. If I don't answer within 24 hours, please feel free to call or send a text. Yeah, I think that's it. All right, everybody. I'll be seeing you soon. Take care. Stay healthy.